Afternoon, everyone. My name is Tony Cothran. Welcome to this afternoon's panel session on cyber readiness. We've got a distinguished group of panelists here today. And to moderate this group, we have Rear Admiral Mike Brown. Mike is a career Navy officer. He's now a distinguished career in government. He's now working with RSA, and he's going to be leading us through this panel. We will be taking questions. There are note cards on your seats. If you will pass those to the INSA interns, they'll pass them up to me, and we'll get those in towards the end of the panel. But Mike, over to you.
Thanks, Tony. As Tony mentioned, the most important part of this session is the questions from you. So please take advantage of the opportunity for the great panel that is here. I will quickly introduce each of them and then get into some questions that I had prepared beforehand. And all the way to my right is Paula Bate, who's the Executive Assistant Director for Criminal, Cyber, Response, and Services Branch of the FBI. Next to him is Rear Admiral T.J. White, who's the Commander of the Cyber Mission Force, U.S. Cyber Command. Right in the middle is Lieutenant General Paul Nakasone, the Commanding General of U.S. Army Cyber Command. Next to him is Ron Bashir, who's the Vice President for Professional Services, Global Services, and in the Intelligence Group at FireEye. And immediately to my right is Mark Neidinger, who's the Director of Federal Network Resilience at DHS. Okay, gentlemen, first question, and Paul Abate, I'd like to start with you. Given the seemingly ever-increasing number of large-scale hacking operations, what improvements to our standing operating procedures have you seen or implemented, and what best practices for cybersecurity are providing us an opportunity to try to keep pace with the threat?
So first of all, thank you for the question, and thank you for having us all here today. Appreciate the opportunity. So in terms of best practices from the FBI perspective, I look at a couple of things. Just the basics of our organization, and one of them is the forward deployment of our personnel out in the field, both domestically across the United States, and then importantly around the world as well. So we currently have within the FBI now, within our 56 field offices across the United States, a cyber task force in each of the field offices. And that consists, of course, of our FBI agents, analysts, and other professional support staff, but also, most importantly, the partnership. So we have embedded within those squads a cross-section of partners, task force officers from federal, state, and local levels, and also in some cases the private sector. And that's been huge in terms of enabling the operations that we do on the prevention side, most importantly, and then also on the investigative side when we have to respond to an incident, make victim notifications, or the other work that we do day in and day out. And I really want to highlight when we look internationally, globally around the world, as many of you know, we have legal attaché offices and U.S. embassies and consulates around the world. We're in over 90 now. And within those, we've begun to spread out and embed cyber assistant legal attachés. Those are FBI agents, again, enabled by intelligence analysts, forward deployed out into the field internationally. And that has been a critical development, and I think a best practice in terms of the cyber work that we do. When you look at some of the investigations we've conducted with foreign partners and with the interagency, and some of the takedowns that we've done. And I'd highlight the Yahoo intrusion case and the recent wrap-up that we did earlier this year, enabled in large part by our foreign partners. We were even able to reach out through and with our Canadian partners and arrest one of the individuals that was indicted and charged in that case, Kareem Baratov up in Canada. And we could not have done that without the help and partnership of the Canadian RCMP and the Toronto Police Services. And it's just that effective partnership that we have, again, with the interagency and on the, in the foreign arena, to relentlessly pursue that work, hunt people down that have committed crimes, and bring them back to face justice here in the United States. Thank you.
So, Mike, I don't know if you're going in like name order, but
Happy to have you jump in, Paul.
if I might. So first of all, thanks to INSA and FCA for the fall of the conference. It's always good to be back, and I think as we take a look at the topic today, never perhaps a more appropriate topic that needs to be addressed. It's interesting because I think every so often there's an event that tends to propel us forward. And I think we hear a lot of times about the intrusion that takes place, but sometimes less about the response. And so I would say WannaCry that we just all went through was one of those kind of seminal events. And I know for my service and for the Department of Defense, a critical learning capability for us to take a look and say, how do we approach a rapidly dangerous intrusion and be able to react very quickly and correspondingly to be able to mitigate the threat. So for us as a service, we have about 1.1 million endpoints on our network. So as WannaCry hits in the middle of May, one of the things that I think took place, at least within the Army, and I think it's broadly in DoD, is just the general recognition that no longer is this just, a network to provide a service. This is a network that has to be rapidly defended. So within a period of 24, 48, 72 hours, I know the Army reacted very, very rapidly in terms of being able to, first of all, identify the problem, see itself, and then for us, we quarantined over 100,000 endpoints that were vulnerable. So for us, I would tell you that is a remarkable transition in terms of our thinking and our reaction time.
So, Ron, I'm going to come to you next because as a member of the private sector, I'd like to see and hear your perspective from the question and also the role the private sector can play when operating with the public sector.
Great, and thank you, and I'll reiterate the thanks to the panel here and having us to speak about this important topic. I'll piggyback off of what the general said, and I think when you think about best practices or how we shift our thinking in terms of tactics and strategy, and this goes across private sector in my experience in working with government and federal agencies as well, is shifting to thinking from a purely preventative mindset or compliance mindset over to how to interdict adversaries once they're operating in your environment, and also how to make your environment more resilient to attack. And so I think the example that was given there is a perfect example of the ability to say, not just how do we make sure that this thing doesn't hit us, because eventually you're going to have to deal with that reality, but how do I make sure I have an environment where if I do start to experience a large-scale issue and major risk to my operations or my mission, I can pivot, I can ensure ongoing operations to critical pieces of the infrastructure, I can interdict the adversaries quickly and efficiently without having to take down my entire infrastructure or put significant harm to my operations, right? So rethinking how we build our capacity, not just on the cyber defense side, but also how we build these networks and systems in a way that has redundancy, resiliency, and the ability to quickly identify and isolate attackers in the environment really positions both private sector and the government, I think, to be much more responsive and reduce the risk and impact to these events as they occur. The other thing I'll mention that we start to look at from a more advanced capability is getting beyond the reaction. So advising organizations on how to become more predictive and proactive in their own environment. So not just waiting for the signs of that first attack to come through and the fire alarm to go off, so to speak, but how to pivot from that posture to patrolling your environment, understanding what normal looks like, and identifying those actors before they have an opportunity to begin serious operations against you in a way that would, again, impact you operationally is very, very important. And I think it's kind of the next generation capacity that we have to think about beyond that resiliency component of how we build these systems and infrastructures.
So TJ, you're next. With respect to your national mission that U.S. Cyber Command has, how are you looking at today's situation, the best practices, and obviously trying to keep pace and keep ahead of the threat?
So I think the best practices are actually pretty well known, or they're at least easily knowable. There's any number of resources that you can go to in the public domain and find out what the top 10, whether DHS distributes or what used to be NSA, IAD, or whomever. There's 5, 10, 15 things that if everybody did, that would make it hard for everybody to get in. So just exchanging that information, knowing that knowledge, and educating everyone that you could possibly can, that's a good standard. I think the second thing is, how do we, to the point about anticipating what's going to happen, how do you get predictive? That's probably going to begin with the relationship between the private sector, academia, industry, and government to some degree. Those sorts of relationships are perhaps not always as robust and open as they could be, or that we would like them to be, and those relationships aren't as well structured perhaps as they might need to be going forward. At the end, it's going to be a question of when someone is going to be penetrated or intruded upon, as opposed to if. That's just, I think, the reality that we live in. And so I think it is a fundamental national security concern about, how does the nation view this, going forward.
So Mark, you get, from a DHS perspective, the opportunity to deal with all the organizations here, the private sector, with the national security elements, law enforcement. How are you looking at the threat, keeping ahead of the threat from a DHS perspective, and integrating best practices and standard operating procedures?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Looking across, the entire government landscape, because we deal with agencies as large as VA to agencies that are so small out in Nevada that they actually has more horses than cars, right? So we have to take a look at the full gamut of environments that we need to deal with and where there may be vulnerabilities associated with it. So we're looking at basically how we can be proactive and help the agencies be proactive from 3 different perspectives: awareness, agility, and reflectiveness. So from awareness perspective, working with such programs as our continuous diagnostic mitigation programs so we can get the sensors out there so the agencies are much more cognizant of what's going on in their environment. I can give you a perspective. Prior to the CDM program moving forward and through the discovery phase, there were agencies that basically were thinking that they had the entire infrastructure understood from an endpoint perspective, but in reality they only really saw 2/3 of their infrastructure. So putting those sensors out there, having a better understanding of what is out there from an awareness perspective is the first key element there. Second is, from agility, is given all those endpoints across the 125 agencies that we work with, how can we help those agencies be able to pinpoint where they need to focus their attention and their resources? And that's through such things as our CDM dashboard activity, where each agency at each component level will be able to raise up to a department level dashboard to understand where the issue is, where the mitigation needs to be, and address and redirect the resources to that effectively, and do it quickly from an agility perspective. Thirdly, from a reflective aspect, because basically one of the things that we have actually expanded our capacity on is how can we help the agencies be able to prepare and take a look at where they are from a people, process, and technology perspective in advance of the next incident. From a people perspective, regards to their skill sets and their understanding of how to leverage effectively the tools that are being implemented. From a process perspective, as we find and as we move out more complex cybersecurity tools, it's not only going to be a challenge for the workforce in understanding how to apply that, and we have to be prepared for it, but also how do you leverage that from a governance aspect within those departments? Because from a governance aspect, when you move forward complex cyber tools, you need to understand not only the technology piece, but you need to understand the impact on the mission and how you're going to manage that impact. And then finally, in regards to the technology piece, is ensuring that we do have the most updated and available technology available we can push out. So from a proactive perspective, it's really awareness, making sure that we have the capacity out there, that we understand where the incidents and the situations occurring. Second, in regards to agility, making sure that we know where to focus our attention. And thirdly, in regards to making sure we have the best tools. And in part of that, because of the 125 agencies that we work across, we also know that there's dependencies across each agency, hundreds and hundreds of dependencies. So through that, and through the capacity that we're putting in place with our various programs, it's not only looking at helping the agency understand how to protect themselves, but also in protecting themselves, what impact it has on the multitude of applications and other agencies that are connected to it. So we're really in a proactive mode. We're prepared on the reactive, but given the environment of the agencies and the complexities of the agencies that we deal with, we need to be able to support those agencies in preparing for themselves.
So if I might follow up on one thing, because I think Mark hits a very good point. One of the things that we, coming back to WannaCry, that we thought about almost immediately is, so where are they going to go next? We have ransomware, we have the danger of ransomware. The tendency is for us to get in that, cone of excellence and say, what do we do now about what we're facing? But really what we're trying to do is to say, okay, what's going to come at us next? And this predictive analysis that we're demanding of our intelligence analysts, that we're looking for in our partners, is really what we're trying to strike here. And much of the relationship building that goes on is that idea of, hey, what can we share that provides you better insight, that provides us better insight?
So I want to build right off of that, and since there's two Pauls, I'm going to be formal. General, this is with you. So we've made truly significant changes with respect to information sharing, both between the government, or amongst the government, as well as working with industry. How do you see those changes being effective in actually countering the threat levels that we see today? And are there other things that we should be thinking about? And in particular, I want to mention two things. One is the information sharing relationship that NATO has with private sector organizations. And the second is the Cyber Threat Alliance, which is the private sectors working together to be able to build out a greater ecosystem. How can we look at better, more effective information sharing models as we go forward?
So a couple things I would offer. So one is the idea of, I think we are convinced, whether or not you're in government, you're in private sector, whether or not you're in academia, is that sharing has to take place, and that is clearly what we have to do. Now, how do we make it most efficient? I think that's the question that we have struggled with for quite some time. So in some sense, how do we have the ability to read more key leaders of industry onto the security clearances necessary for them to take a look at some of the things that we're able to garner? At the same time, how do we quickly form a partnership without a bevy of lawyers to work with the private sector? We experience this in terms of intrusions that we've had and being able to leverage the private sector knowledge that is what? That is expansive, that is in-depth, that is unclassified, that at most times is shareable. And so those are two things that certainly come to my mind as we take a look at the sharing process.
Thanks. Admiral, from your perspective, what do you think?
I think policy is incomplete and unsettled. I don't know that I have a very good idea of what private sector would like from me. So I think I have some knowledge gaps, and I probably ought to be a little bit more complete and open and sort of asking for those sort of knowledge asks. Some of them I could probably answer very quickly or provide with a little bit of careful review. So I think I need to get past that. I do think as we look at some of our partners, particularly in the UK with the NCSC, that's a model that seems to be where, as a matter of their national decision making, they have chosen to accept a fair bit of risk in opening up private sector and academia into the government security infrastructure to get at this process of knowledge acquisition and sharing, and then to get to what General Nakasone talks about, being predictive in what's next. Because I don't think the adversaries are going to be too careful about distinguishing who they victimize, right? So if it's going to come to one, it will ultimately come to all. And I think if that's sort of an organizing construct, to backstop the imperative, we could probably get there. But that's a different sovereign entity. They have a different perspective about how they interact with each other. So I think there's just a good opportunity for us to have this dialogue as a nation.
Thanks. Ron, from the private sector side, again, you're part of the ecosystem and you're seeing the ecosystem grow. What's your perspective?
Yeah, so I think what we've observed on the private sector side is, good or bad, my observation is a fragmentation, and I think a lot of that fragmentation of kind of trust circles, if you will, or sharing initiatives, and to your point, and a number of different initiatives out there, and smaller groups, maybe more focused by industry vertical forming on their own, or kind of with support of international or local government help. I think there's a key component of why that's occurring, why that fragmentation is occurring. It all comes down to trust, right? So when we talk about a sharing model, the basic tenet of any model has to be, I'm trusting you with sensitive information, I trust that you're going to do the right thing with that data, and I trust that I'm going to get some value back out of what I share with you. So those two components have to play against each other. I have to trust you enough to share my information, and I have to feel like I'm getting value back out of that relationship. I think that's a hard barrier in some cases for organizations that feel either, for right or wrong, I'm sharing information and I don't get a ton of value back because maybe it's more general or not focused on my needs or my concerns in my industry, which is why you see these more fragmented kind of verticals sprouting up that are very focused, for instance, on the tech sector and private sharing that's very relevant to what they're doing. I think on the other side of it is obviously concerns around national security and how much and how detailed information you share with private sector and how that may or may not get disclosed in negative ways in broader audiences. So, and the other thing I'll say about sharing is, again, from a use case perspective, it can't just be relevant, it has to be timely. And so what we see often is there's great relevant information that we can bring to bear from industry and government sharing information, but sometimes they come out in reports that happen years after the fact or months after the fact. And it's nice, it's educational, you learn something, but it's not very useful in the moment when I need real-time information to make decisions about what I should do or not do in my infrastructure to prepare for what we think may be coming next. So I think a key component of how we think about sharing going forward has to get beyond, our model of the, let's call it the CNN sharing model of these are the interesting things happening in the world of cyber and these are why they're important, but automated real-time sharing of actual technical information that can get pushed down machine to machine in near real time to actually affect a community protection type of a goal, which is really what you're trying to accomplish here, right? At the end of the day, you're trying to say the first victim in an attack is the last victim because every other person, every other organization that is targeted has received the information, done the analysis, got inoculated against it, have the signatures, and that attack is now useless against everyone else who has that information. So if you can achieve that at speed, at scale, you're really doing well. But as mentioned here, I think we've got a number of barriers to getting to that nirvana of where we need to be with information sharing.
So Mark, again, from a DHS perspective, you've got the heart of the government working with the private sector right there. Took years of slogging through the lawyers to make that happen. I recall all of that. And you've got programs in place where not only are you automatically sharing information, but some of the stuff that you talked about with respect to CDM is providing a greater situational awareness picture. Right. How effective is that, and where do you see the need for us working together to go?
Yeah, the program that you referenced, the AIS, or Automated Indicator Sharing Program, that came out of the Cybersecurity Act of 2015, was a key way of opening up the opportunity for threat indicators to be shared from the private sector to the government, and that's been very effective. The numbers of private entities that are sharing are increasing on a regular basis. So that's a very positive way of sharing threat indicators along with our other partners that we share back to the agencies, because we also share indicators via Einstein. But beyond that, from working with industry, I think we need to look beyond the type of, beyond threat indicator sharing, which again I think is becoming very effective, to also experience sharing. And I think if you think about that in regards to the, the executive order that came out for cybersecurity and who's been engaged in regards to that, it's been a high percentage of private sector and industry. Taking a look at, okay, where should the government be concentrating and thinking about cyber? I think that's very positive in bringing the private sector into it. Secondly, if as, and I don't know how many agencies are here, but as we're seeing key CIO positions being filled, we're also seeing an influx of industry coming into the government at the CIO level. So from the industry experience of being able to share at the executive level within the agency, as well as really being part and partner of the community that needs to work together for cyber for the government area, there certainly has been an increase in regards to involvement. We're looking at other type of programs that we can also bring more private sector input in regards to threats and other indicators, but I think we also need to take a look at the success that we're starting to have with the partnerships that we're also building in other areas.
So Paul, I didn't forget you down there at the end, and you mentioned a little bit in the first question about some things that you're doing, but what do you see as potential needs from a law enforcement perspective with respect to information sharing, some of the things that we may need to do, or things even at the state and local level in the interaction that you're doing from a law enforcement perspective to allow, again, all of us to be more effective?
Yeah, we need to achieve really a state of hyper-collaboration across the interagency at all levels and across government and then with the private sector. I think building relationships of trust with the private sector and relentlessly pursuing information intelligence sharing is critical to the work that we're doing here, ensuring cybersecurity and managing cyber risk. We cannot do it without each other, no matter what community that is. And then, to that point, we have a number of mechanisms and structures in place to achieve that. In partnership with some of the agencies up here. With DHS, for example, we have the Domestic Security Alliance Council. We also have InfraGard. I've seen some members of both of those groups out in the audience here today before we came up here to join in the panel. And again, it's all about building those relationships in advance of bad things happening and having the ability, as Ron pointed out, to move information and intelligence in a timely, speedy way and identifying what's significant and what's not and getting that to the right people sort of in a two-way sharing relationship. And then I was talking with the Admiral prior to the panel as well. It's important to point out we have to share those relationships with each other, I think, in the information that grows out of it, but also important is the relationships we all have and the individuals or detailees that we exchange, and we depend on that every day, 24/7, to do this type of work. The Admiral was highlighting one of our agents who used to work within the framework of his organization, incredibly talented agent out there on his own in the fort, building those relationships with our partners up there in DOD and other agencies, and bringing what we take in through DSOC, InfraGard, and the relationships that we build informally and in forums like this, and bringing that back in and sharing it across as well. That's all hugely important to achieving this task and accomplishing our goals.
Thanks. Now, this next question is for the General and the Admiral, and then I'd like Ron to provide the private sector perspective. So, TJ first. How are we mitigating the vulnerabilities that arise in both our defense and national security agencies based upon those agencies' dependencies upon commercial technology? And how do you see the industry proactively working with the national security agencies to help to mitigate vulnerabilities and deliver capabilities for you?
So broadly speaking, I think that the relationship in terms of the provision of goods and services and analytics and so on between the private sector and broadly the defense or the security infrastructure and agencies is actually pretty good, pretty efficient. I do think it would be a little bit of hubris for the DoD to think that it has an answer to this problem, which will be separate and distinct on those advances that the private sector is already wrestling with as well. I think the private sector probably has an ability to turn at a little bit faster rate. I think they have probably an opportunity to look through different lenses that will often sort of constrain sort of the processes and the very structured mechanisms that we live in. It also seems to point to this idea that the answer might be to return to an era of government shipyards and government arsenals, which I have read about, but I have no experience with. And I don't know that there is anyone who would offer that is, a case of going, the future ought to be that tied to the past. Mm-hmm. I do think, though, that, we could observe a couple things. Government's big. The private sector is bigger. And if we can figure out a right way for that collaboration to be more transparent and trust confident, in there is going to be an answer that'll work well. I just don't know what that is.
Okay. Paul?
So I come back to the proactive versus reactive. We've all lived the intrusions on the reactive side. And so what do we learn from industry? We learn from industry that they're pretty proactive in terms of looking very seriously about their vulnerabilities. How do they do that? Well, they do it by crowdsourcing. They do it by, bug bounties. So we've had a series of these now within the Department of Defense. Hack the Pentagon, hack the Army, hack the Air Force. I would speak from my own experiences. That's always an initial interesting conversation to have with senior leaders in your service. When you say, hey, I'd like to bring these people in to actually hack our network and expose our vulnerabilities. And after you get after, I'd like to bring these people in, there's a different conversation which you have to have, which is the cost benefit is significantly in our favor. After we get done paying the bounty, after we get done investing the time, what we have is we have a more defendable, a more resilient network, a network that better protects our data. From our perspective in the Army, we did our bug bounty against human resources command. That is the #1 data source for the Army. Think about the information that could be had. What did OPM teach us? That data was a target. And so in response to that, I think coming back to the idea of how do you become proactive in making sure you have a defendable and resilient network is something that we have learned a lot from industry.
Iran, from your perspective, private sector.
That's a great point. I think on the testing and the red teaming, I think it's a great takeaway from, and actually, that's my heritage in the Air Force was doing exactly that, right? You got to emulate the adversary, find your weaknesses before they do. I'll get a little philosophical, right? You take the traditional triangle of better, faster, cheaper, and make it into the analysis of better or more secure, faster, cheaper, right? And I think for the most part, in this run-up through, the tech boom in the late 90s to today, most private industry has chosen faster and cheaper over secure, right? For obvious business reasons, right? The faster to market, the faster I can capture a market, the faster I can create new and exciting things for people to go use and buy, I make more money, right? So it's an easy risk trade-off until you get to the point of now it becomes a national security question of we're using that same software, that same technology to run, critical operations in cyberspace for military and national security purposes. So we have to kind of go back and rethink, I think, a little bit on those trade-offs we're making. Maybe it is going back to, not all the way back to, government sourced, but maybe putting some more components around that additional level of security and design from the beginning stages, especially for the most critical components of technology that you're thinking about for next generation platforms, for example. I do think it's a valid point that industry in general, especially if they have public eyes on them or the risk of public disclosure, will absolutely take it upon themselves to try to find their own flaws quickly, but they're not perfect, right? It's still an asymmetric space, and it will be, I think, for a very long time, because the more complexity I put into what we're building, software and technology, the more opportunities there are for failures, and not just single points of failure, but kind of interactive failures that are frankly becoming impossible for people to completely understand and model. And so you have to anticipate that at some point somebody's going to find that one flaw that you haven't seen, observed, or thought about, and goes back to that resiliency model as well. I do think being able to test and validate and assume that there are flaws in what you're building is a good starting point, but it's certainly not a panacea.
Thanks. I'm going to ask a workforce question now. I'd like all of you to think and provide a response. And then after you've all responded, I'm going to follow up with a twist that came in from the audience with respect to one of the questions. We all know trained and certified personnel with cyber skills are at the top of the list for all of us. The question is our overall cyber bench strength equal to the needs, the true operational needs that we have both inside government and private sector? And they're pretty sure the answer is no. So what do we need to do to be able to expand the level of skills and the skilled workforce for both industry and government? And Mark, if I could lead with you, please.
Yeah. So, excuse me. From an authorities aspect, I have unfortunately the allergies are getting to me today. Sorry about that. But from an authorities aspect, DHS and the other agencies, we have the authorities to be able to bring cyber folks in relatively rapidly. The issue is still the competition. Competition with industry, competition with banks, healthcare areas, and things of that nature. So we have looked at ways of being able to increase compensation, cyber pay, and things of that nature, but still we're in competition. So what will help us and what we're looking at is, well, how do we bring this talent pool in and give them the opportunities that they're seeking so that at least they'll, even though they may not be getting the same compensation, they will still have interest in the excitement. And this gets back into looking at the model that USDS, US Digital Services, put in place, where they bring in people from industry on a continual basis and very rapidly. And part of that model is how we can be able to identify specific key mission areas that those individuals would have a high interest, as well as being able to turn the timetable so that they can move from one thing to another. It seems to work well with the USDS model. It's something that we're also investigating in addition to that. Now, what does that mean for the bulk of the cyber workforce? Well, if we take a look at the numbers of people that are currently involved in the cyber workforce, we run into another issue, which is in essence training and capacity to be able to leverage the cybersecurity tools and also to leverage it from an information perspective of making decisions. So we need to be able to invest in regards to our current workforce to do that. If we invest into our current workforce, then basically we're going to be able to offset in regards to the numbers, because we have a lot of folks that just need that additional training. And if we're able to bring in more of the industry expertise through a similar model like USDS, I think that's a good balancing act. I don't think we'll ever have sufficient numbers in place just because of the turnover rate that we also are facing in regards to competition. But I think we're certainly getting smarter as to how we can be able to be more competitive, and also take a look at how we can better retain the workforce, the younger workforce that we need to bring in. But it continues to be a challenge.
Paul, from a law enforcement perspective, I know that multiple directors have had this as one of their priorities. What are you seeing, and what do you think we need to do?
Yeah, just to get to your original question, to keep up with the operational needs of our agencies and departments in the cyber arena is a huge, huge challenge. And as you mentioned, we have been putting, for a period of years now, a lot of thought and effort into recruitment and retention and training and education for our existing workforce. A lot of efforts around that, and much of it's done in conjunction with our partners up here in government from a recruiting standpoint. We are out constantly looking for cyber talented and trained individuals. to bring into the organization. We have a number of mechanisms from the FBI to do that. We have an internship program where we're reaching down into colleges and universities and bringing people in early during the summers to sell the FBI and the mission to them. And I think that's the number one thing we all have going for us is the mission and the sense of purpose. We cannot compete with private industry in terms of money and the financial benefits, obviously. So it is that mission and sense of purpose, which is everything, and nothing more compelling than what we all do in terms of protecting this country and keeping people safe each and every day. And we feel like if we can get people in the door, if they're not already inspired by that, and they see what we do every day together with each other to accomplish those goals, they're going to want to come on board and they're going to want to be a part of that team. So we're very focused on those efforts at all levels, high school, college, university. And then we've also been focusing internally on our existing workforce to train those agents, analysts, professional staff, whoever, and get them up to speed with the cyber skills that they need to meet the demands of the current environment, threat environment that we operate in. So it's sort of a multi-dimensional approach within the FBI, across the organization, and then much of it we do in conjunction with our partners. We're often out together at recruiting events and working together to bring the right talented people on board and be part of the team.
So I think there's two-part answer to the question. So one on the quantity side, do we have enough? No, we want more. But let me focus on the quality side, because I think this is the one that I think the most about. We roughly have about 1,900 people working in our cyber mission force in the Army. I can safely say that I probably know the top 15% of that force. So 100, 150, whatever that is. Those 150 are so important to me and so important to our service that that's where we spend the majority of our time. It's the quality issue. It's losing that top 15% that is so critically damaging to the Army as we take a look at our cyber mission forces of the future. A great coder. A great coder is 100 times more effective than an average coder. 100 times, and that's just back of the envelope analysis from my perspective, but I would tell you that if you've worked in the industry, you have that same feeling. They are that good. So there's two parts to it. The first part is that how do we do a better job of spotting the talent early? Because these are not people that just learn it within a 6-month advanced individual training session within the Army that they get to be good. These are folks that have coded since they've been young kids. So how do we find these people early? And then the other part is, okay, so how do we make it the most attractive place that they want to be, that they want to spend time within our service to do their life's work? And I would say those are the two opposite extremes that we're working at most dedicatedly.
TJ?
So I would backstop and echo everything that General Nakasone says. I say that principally because I benefit from his ability to generate forces, which I use in my mission every day. I would also say that whomever the adversary is, they are not fundamentally better than we are. We are just as smart, just as innovative, perhaps more so because they have a culture that promotes that. And we have a sort of open exchange of ideas and collaboration. We could probably get more efficient on the collaboration side. So we don't have what we need. We need to figure out a way to take the talent which will naturally gravitate to the hard problems that we enjoy being challenged and vexed by, and building a culture and a climate that fosters their retention. I do think that on the talent spotting and getting them into service, we probably could do better in thinking about internships. How do you take young kids and get them in to something like an internship program? How do you take some of your talent that's very much overperforming and give them an opportunity to intern for a spell outside of service, and then rapidly on-ramp them back as they choose to do it? I do think there may be an opportunity to consider something that looks like a cyber reserve corps. That's 2 corps, C-O-R-E and C-O-R-P-S. I think some combination of both of those on the talent side could do well for the nation writ large, whether that's government service or private sector or academia. And I think as a leader, one of the things I've tried to do is work really hard to clear the field of any obstacles for those high performers that we have so that they can just continue to move as fast as they can, solving the problems that we have.
So being a good cryptologist, you've obviously read my next question because you've mentioned it, which is what I'd like to go to now, which there's been talk in Congress about a possible cyber reserve core of both types that you mentioned. Private employees working in cyber jobs that can serve their country in a reserve capacity. What do you, I'd like to hear from Ron and from Mark on this as to the potential, the pros and cons with respect to having that type of model. Ron?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I think it's a great idea. I mean, touching on the points that were made earlier, we're kind of in a situation with cyber talent these days that I think about it like college basketball, right? You get really talented individuals that go and get their basic education and training somewhere, and that may be in the government and maybe in private sector, and then they quickly graduate into quote unquote the pros, and then they decide where the hardest problems are, where the most interesting problems are, or maybe where the biggest paycheck is, and then they go get that paycheck or that job. I think we have to get a little comfortable with the model or the thinking that, you know, the rotational idea or the ability for individuals to experience different problem sets and to keep their skills sharp and to get varying skills is something I think that motivates that top tier talent that the general was speaking of. Those guys that you really want on your team, they're going to get bored quickly if you don't continually present them with additional challenges. Cyber is a little bit different in that respect because it's a constant evolution of problem sets that you're putting in front of people, and it's not a very static environment from many perspectives, but not the least of which is the threats are always changing, and so the things you have to respond to are always changing, and so the ability to give people the opportunity to experience different environments, different risk pictures, different missions, right, in private or government, but also have the ability to say, when the need is there, I would very much like to be able to volunteer my skill sets and come back and support, critical incident response or critical, cyber support engagements when necessary. I think, if we can make that work, I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, no, I totally agree as well. And actually, the USDS model I referenced before is very similar to trying to bring in industry folks into the government, give them, to your perspective, opportunities that would excite them, mission-focused, time-limited, and then have them have multiple opportunities to work across different agencies. I think that's been very effective. So I certainly support that. The challenge is, though, is that when we talk about cyber, oftentimes we're also looking into environments that clearances may be a challenge. And for private sector to come in a quick fashion, given the clearance requirements, that could be a challenge. But what we are also doing along the same line in regards to putting a core together is, DHS offers a lot of services to the agencies for incident response. So we're also working with agencies to actually develop core groups within the agencies to take on the same skill sets so that they internally have the capacity to do that on call, as well as be able to bring those core groups to a critical incident situation if we need to. So that is something that we've started working on from leveraging the internal workforce. But again, I totally agree with that. The challenge would be on the clearance piece, but I think we have a very effective model from what USDS is doing in actually bringing that talent in. But unfortunately, given the clearance level, it is limited as to what they're going to be working on.
Thanks. So you're obviously doing well as panel members because some of the questions that have come in are actually targeted at individuals, so I'm going to move along to some of those. First, Lieutenant General Nakasone, please describe the cyber training being done at U.S. Army Cyber Command and where you see the training going in the next 3 to 5 years?
So very good question. In terms of our cyber mission forces, there are 14 work roles that we've identified are the standard upon which we train to. So we continue to use the services as the individual training model to bring soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Coast Guardsmen into our force. And then we have a joint approach to training. So we took a look at the model that has been, I think, done very well at places like the National Security Agency and Special Forces. And we said, we're going to have a joint standard for our training. So everyone that comes to U.S. Cyber Command goes through this joint cyber training that lasts anywhere from 8 weeks to 18 months. Once that's complete, whatever soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine shows up on your force for Admiral White has the same baseline of training. So that's the model. It's joint, it's targeted, it has standards. Where do I see it going? I would say that I see it going in 2 different areas. First of all, I see this joint model continuing to morph in terms of what are the critical niche, what I would say important areas that we've got to focus on that have to be trained outside of what the services do. And the second piece is collective training. How do we train a team together? It's great to be an individual, but when you had to have a defense or an offensive team, how do you replicate the environment? How do you replicate the adversary? How do you ensure that the environment they're going to operate in looks as close to what they need to be able to accomplish as possible? So I think the growth in collective training will also be, I think foundationally different as we move into the future.
So even though the questions are directed at an individual, if anybody else has any comments, please chime in as I go through these. Mark, next one's for you, and I'm not sure, but this may be related to the Yankees complaining about the Red Sox use of wearables. Some members of Congress have recently proposed new legislation on Internet of Things, security standards for IoT devices, the certification of those devices, et cetera. What are your thoughts on the strengths and weaknesses of this proposal?
Okay. Well, Internet of Things, as we're looking at a lot of areas that we had not previously considered as vulnerable, I'm thinking through our work like with ICS CERT, where we're working with the dams, we're working with airlines and fuselage in regards to areas that may be vulnerable. There needs to be more emphasis in regards to how we're approaching that and awareness by the CIOs as to how that may apply within their organizations. As to certification and that point, I really can't talk to that specifically, but what I can talk to is that there definitely is, and I'm thinking about a recent CIO council meeting where the awareness level is certainly increasing as to what they need to consider when we're coming in and talking about high-value assets. One of the things that DHS does at this point is work with the agencies to assess our high-value assets. Going beyond the application layer and looking into the industrial control systems and things of that nature is certainly an increasing area that we're going to be focusing on because it can have major ramifications to it. But we are concentrating along that line, but I can't really speak to the certification.
So I think, and Ron, I'd like you to jump in because I think part of the thrust here is it's probably not good enough for U.S. legislation when we're talking about global environment, IoT. Producers are around the world and the potential implications of not having a coordinated effort amongst nations to come up with the right policy.
I think if you think about standards in terms of connected devices, right, that's such a wide universe of potential products out there that the only standard I could think of that addresses all of that is to say maybe that any company that makes these things has to have some sort of formal product security program in place to address both the security and remediation of vulnerabilities in those products. Beyond that, I think the appropriate way to think about regulation in that space is by industry, right? So when I think about medical devices versus aircraft fuselage, right, or aircraft control, right, much different space, right, in terms of risks, exposures, and how those devices are going to be used, sold, distributed, maintained. So I think from my perspective, if I'm going to think about a regulatory environment, I think the agency or agencies responsible for regulating that industry in general should probably be the ones to think about specific standards or guidance that applies to those quote-unquote things that have the potential to be connected and vulnerable to attack. I think it's early days on that, on how we think about that, but I think it's a little bit challenging to think about it from a monolithic perspective of the Internet of everything, because it's just too many different and varied risks and use cases there to really address under one gigantic umbrella.
Thanks. For the next question, Paula Bate and TJ, if you could chime in on this. Is the intelligence community adequately resourced and as timely and effective as it needs to be to support both the cyber offensive and defensive missions for both DoD and for all of government?
So that's an impolitic question.
I'm just reading the card, man.
Look, at the end of the day, we operate within those resources that are given to us through the right appropriations and authorizations vehicles. I do think that you could always make a case broadly that if you had more, you could do more. I do think we have an obligation to look internal and make sure that we're being efficient. I think we do have an obligation to look across and make sure that we're collaborating. Broadly speaking, though, I think that for where we are today, we're probably sufficient. But I think that we also, as prudent planners and in thinking about what's likely coming down the pipe in the context of threat, which is expanding and increasing in terms of the vulnerability, which is pretty high, and then what the attendant consequences could be for the nation. It's always a good dialogue to ask if you have what you need.
Do you think we have more or less on offense or defense? I mean, this is the piece that we're kind of struggling with right now.
Yeah.
So I think the first thing you would want to do is be careful about saying it's one or the other.
Right.
I do think that there's a benefit and advantage in a thinking organization to accept and appreciate that one ought inform the other. There's a lot to be learned in anticipating what you might have to do on the offense by understanding very, very well what's going on the defense. And I think that as you go about your business under the right and appropriate authorities regime on the offensive side, that can also deeply inform what you need to do on the defense.
So the reason I say that is Admiral White and I have worked together for many years, and I think this is the piece that we've always talked about is how do we ensure that this workforce that we're developing doesn't get stovepiped into one or the other. Because we always believed as we were working towards the standard of cybercom that the most effective piece is that the offense was going to inform the defense and the defense was going to inform the offense. And now we start to take a look and see are we true to our form and being able to assign people from the defensive side to the offensive side and the offensive side to the defensive side.
So I should have asked this question first because it supports it, the conversation just there. And the reason I didn't was because I didn't want to go straight to Mark, but I'm going to do it now and then look to both Paul and to DoD to respond. With regard to PPD 41, the National Cyber Incident Response Plan that was issued in the last year, what real specific changes have occurred for the federal agencies since these documents were issued? And, whoa, I should have read the whole question. I'm getting a question here. What is the private sector, e.g. RSA, view of these documents, and what role do private sector companies see themselves providing in response to significant cyber incident? So, Mark, if we could go to there and then DoD, and then I guess I have to answer.
Yeah. I guess from the perspective of the agencies. The agencies are much more aware as to the sequence of activities that need to occur for an incident. It also provides an opportunity for clearly articulating the partnerships that will occur based on an incident itself. So I think it really helps agencies understand who they should be contacting when, as well as how we can, during major incidents, be able to effectively and quickly work with our partners.
Okay. DoD? TJ, any input?
No, sir, I'm good.
Okay. Paul Bate?
Yeah,
From the
I'll
law
jump in.
enforcement side?
I would say that the policy directive has, by defining the lanes and the road, has helped us work better together and more effectively and efficiently, particularly in dealing with the private sector in response to an incident. I mean, it's been immensely helpful. It's still not always perfect, but I think we're at a better place because of the issuance of the policy directive than we were before. But we have to continue to work, day in and day out in partnership with each other to best execute the mission, particularly when we deal with the public and the private sector.
So I don't know if the person that wrote the question wrote it because of my background. So I obviously was responsible for writing the first National Cyber Incident Response Plan, and the whole intent was to have whole of government working with the private sector. And I think that one of the things that we have to focus on now is something that we started, which was not just wargaming, but it's something that we do in DoD all the time. It's the training, it's the battle rhythm, it's not just knowing who to call, but you actually understand what the capabilities are, the capacities are for all of the partners in the delivery of whatever we're doing in response to the activity that's ongoing, and knowing where the strengths and weaknesses are. And I think we need to truly upgrade our ability to have a regular battle rhythm around training. All right.
So if I might add to that, I mean, we're seeing this right now as we take a look at Hurricane Harvey, Irma, Jose that follows it. So we have worked very, very closely with FEMA to provide communication support. And I think that the department, through its defense support of civil authorities, has this down very, very well. And I think to your point, Mike, which is, so what's the same procedures that we're going to follow with, the huge incident that's going to come someday is really the next step for all of us.
Exactly. TJ, this one's for you. We talked about the training program that DoD has, but could you please speak to the prospect of standardizing the cyber toolkit, vulnerability assessment tools, other capabilities that are necessary to improve the readiness among our cyber forces?
So that's actually a really, really good question. I think we started out a couple years ago probably with a requirement to have a kit. The services did what services do, and they went off and they did some operational design, some review, some best practice benchmarking, and they each went off on a path to acquire. Fortunately, a lot of those kits are built and grow out of commercial solutions. So whether by design or happenstance, there's a lot of commonality and overlap. However, in a joint force, commonality and overlap is insufficient. What you really need is an integrated joint kit, and that is the path that we are on now and that we are pursuing. There's an organization at U.S. Cyber Command called the Capabilities Development Group, CDG, and they are working through the mechanisms to establish architectures and standards, publish and promulgate those, and I think the services, based on the feedback that I have, see what is on the blueprint as a better capability than what exists today, and so moving to that common standard will benefit everybody.
So Ron, this may be a follow-up question to when you were talking about IoT, but how can technology providers or vendors best offer tools now so that cybersecurity is actually built into the design phase of IoT, operational technology, and other smart infrastructure?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to what I was saying earlier, I think, which is you have to incentivize in some way, and that could be, again, by regulation or by standards or by some sort of procurement mechanism that says you will have some baseline of security functionality in the things that you design and take to market, especially in critical industries. One thing I think I've seen that's worked a little bit in that direction, that's incentivized organizations to think about bringing devices to market with some level of built-in security is the whole, it's the DHS program around kind of the cyber insurance, right, for systems. Where companies have some incentive to get their system certified and have that stamp of approval that says, this system has been tested to a certain level of care and is resilient to a certain level of risk, and therefore you garner some benefit in the market if there were to be a negative impact or event targeted against that system. So I think those models can work. I don't know that there's a silver bullet for it, but I think those incentive programs tend to work fairly well, especially for the industries that have a large footprint in those critical infrastructure spaces.
For Paul Abate, in the area of info sharing and victim notifications, several large-scale, including political hacking efforts over the last couple of years, afford the opportunity for learning lessons. Is there anything that you can discuss, lessons learned, with respect to the victim notification piece, getting to the right leadership, and so on?
Victim notification is something that we're very focused on. We're always learning and getting better. It's among our highest priorities, getting out there, whether it's in advance of an attack or incident or after it. We need to let the victims know. So we have learned lessons from the things that we've been through, and we're working hard to apply those so that we make the notifications as speedily and as timely as possible and to the right people so that they're informed.
Thank you.
I'll add a little point to that. From my perspective, especially with the higher profile, executive level breaches that have occurred, and especially the disclosures, right? So in the past, a lot of these attacks were occurring, but they were for intelligence gathering purposes, or they weren't being publicly disclosed for information operations purposes. Now that we're in a battle space, so to speak, that clearly there's adversaries out there that are using information operations as a strategy and a tactic, we have to think a little bit differently about how we protect principal information, because what you've seen in most of these attacks is a blurring of the lines between their professional and personal lives and what's being targeted and what's being taken. So when you think about notifications or protections, it can't stop at the corporate boundary or the professional boundary. It has to include the person's public profile, their use of personal email, and the overlaps that occur, which of course adds a lot of complexity to how you defend against these types of attacks. But we absolutely see, I think, a trend towards more broad targeting of individuals from the purposes of gathering up information on both sides of their lives and using that to their advantage from an operations perspective.
So this next question is for the whole panel, if there's any comments or answers. Question is, we can't defend everything. We can apply generally accepted principles and techniques to stay afloat, but don't have enough cyber talent, while technology keeps advancing and proliferating. What does the panel think, even if it's remote or hypothetical, could break the cybersecurity paradigm? In particular, looking at policy, capacity, technology, or anything that you think has the potential, the greatest potential, to make a difference in this space. Mark, if we could start with you.
Yeah. A different viewpoint from the perspective of we're making huge investments in technology, but are we making, and we are making investments in regards to the workforce, but are we making investments in essence, the soft targets? Soft targets in this case, if we think about insider threat, we have hard insider threat, we have soft insider threat. Hard insider threat is where everything that can be thrown at it will be thrown at it to see if we can break. Soft insider threat is where we take a look at folks that really are not embracing the perspective and the impact of cyber in regards to a mission area. So from an angle of, yes, we're making the investments in regards to sensors and tools and things of that nature, We also need to understand that the level of training that we also need to continue to provide and the commitment of everybody else that's outside the CIO shop, the CISO shop, the IT shop, that is touching the applications that have responsibilities for their mission areas, that they also are part of the community to secure the cyber front. And that's an area that we're heavily focused in now, especially with not only in regards to the mission areas and bringing it so that it's real to them as to what would happen if an incident occurred within their mission area from the various threats, but also to work with them so that they can understand that as they're making their investments, program dollars that they control, that they're bringing cyber in at the front end, as well as when we are putting more sophisticated cyber tools in place, that it's for their benefit in regards to securing the mission and not try to go around it. Now, there's a huge population there that we need to concentrate on that has an impact in regards to either opening the gates or not. So, focusing in that area, I think will have a large impact. We will continue the investment of tools, sensors, threat briefs, and the like, but that's only a small percentage of the population that in essence actually has an impact in being able to bring the threat to life.
Ron, any thoughts on
Yeah,
paradigm
so,
shift?
so here's my perspective. The way you shift the paradigm in this space is to shift the consequences. So what do I mean by that? I think my FBI panelists will appreciate this. I think we're in the early days of what bank robbery was, right, in the turn of the century, where it was a profitable business and most people who did it got away with it, right? So why not? I think that's exactly where we are with the majority of cyber breaches, national security focused as well as criminal focused. Until there's real and significant consequences to a good proportion of the actors who are perpetrating these crimes and these activities, we won't shift the paradigm. So I think getting a focus on how we get better attribution, how we get better prosecution, how we get to an actual consequence for the guys behind these keyboards, that will start to have a real effect on how and where cyber attacks are going to be used, because there's going to be a much more careful consideration. Today, the return on investment and the relative lack of risk to the offensive side of this activity, it's a basic economic problem that won't get solved until there's real consequences for actors.
Any other comments?
Artificial intelligence. End of the day, I think that's going to make winners out of some and losers out of many. And I think as we take a look at what we saw at the DARPA Grand Challenge, self-healing networks, the ability to rapidly find accesses, the army of bots that can be controlled with this type of capability, I think it fundamentally is going to change the game of what we're going to do. And so as I take a look at that, if someone said, hey, where would you want to invest your last dollar? I think it's there.
I want to thank all of the panel members. We've run up against the time. As evidenced by the number of questions I didn't get to answer, obviously the audience was really interested in what you were saying and the answers that you had. So thank you all for participating. For everybody else, there's a network break till 14:30, so thank you also for being here and for the questions.